Well, good morning. My name is Michael. I'm one of the pastors here at Cedarbrook. And I tell you what, I can't get enough of that little intro video. It's so kind of silly, right? All these little Bible characters. There's Jesus, right? It's just a silly thing to me, but we wanted to have some fun with this because some of these things are like things that we learned from Sunday school or like kids' books or kids' Bibles and little things like that. And yet they have such cool, deep lives that we sometimes miss when we just take the little kid version of it. So we're going to take some of the kid version of it, and we're going to expound upon that. And all we're doing in this Characters Message series is we're taking a look at a Bible character, and we're asking and answering three questions. We want to know who they are, we want to know how they connect with Jesus, and what do they have to do with you and me today? And before I let out of the bag who we're going to take a look at today, if you read the newsletter, you already know what's coming. But if you haven't, just be patient. I think we need to think about names, right? Names that we have or are been given, because names are really important in the Bible. They have a deep meaning to them. Like they would name their kids things that they would think that who they are going to be, or they would represent the environment in which they were born in and things like that. They had great meaning to their names. Now, for us, when we name our kids, we don't always maybe put so much meaning in their name, except for if it's an old name and wanting to connect it with a great-great-grandparent or something like that. It has some meaning to it. Or we take a name and we just want the name to be kind of unique so that they don't have every kid in their class being called the same name, right? My favorite thing about that is like when you have names that sound the same, but they're spelled different, like you didn't accomplish anything. It still sounds the same, right? You just spelled it differently. But these names may not have as much meaning for them. We just don't want them, we want them to be unique, but not to like make fun of them, right? But for us, I think that really the names that have meaning for us, good or bad, are what we call nicknames, right? Nicknames, names that people have given to us for whatever reason. Maybe some of those nicknames are good names, like you like that name, like you like to be called Sport or Squirt or Smokey or whatever, right? You might like that. But some of the names that you've been given as nicknames, you may not like so much, right? Maybe that first day of school when you had to wear your first pair of glasses and you got the nickname Four Eyes. Not one that you really want to have, or you were really into science or dinosaurs or things like that, and now people called you a nerd or a dork, or maybe you were just a good kid in class and you got along with your teachers, and so then you became the teacher's pet, right? These are some of the names that we'd like to maybe change, get out of, and not be a part of those names, and it's hard to change those names, right? People think they're funny or whatever, but they don't see the impact that they have on us. And of course, we've been called much, much worse. But that's the idea here, that names are important. And sometimes we'd like to have our name changed. And the person we're going to look at today indeed has their name changed. We're going to talk about Jacob. Jacob, who we're going to read his birth story and see how he got his name, how that name went through his life, and he had to wrestle with who he was and his name until God changed his name. And we're going to see how that name then connects with Jesus and how that has connected with us today. All right, so when we're first going to take a look at this, we're going to take a look at Genesis chapter 25. That's where we're going to find Jacob, and this is his origin story. This is his birth story, his birth narrative, how he came to be. If you do not have a Bible and you'd like to have a Bible, raise your hand nice and high, and we can get you a Bible. And you can take that Bible, you can use that Bible here, and if you have one at home, you can drop it back off at the info desk. If you do not have a Bible at home, we'd love for you to take it home with you so you can have a Bible with you. Of course, you can use your own Bible. You can follow along on the screen as well. So Genesis chapter 25, we're going to hear about how there's a struggle going on about conceiving and having kids with Jacob's parents and what they do about it. So Genesis chapter 25, starting in verse 21. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was childless. the Lord answered his prayer, and his wife became pregnant. The babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. So there's something going on in her. They're not being pregnant. So what do? They go and ask God about it and prayed for God to provide. God provides. Now what God provided is not going so well. So she goes and asks God about it. Here's God's answer in verse 23. The Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other. The older will serve the younger." See, that culture, that's not how it would work, right? The older would always be the greater. The younger would serve the older, but it's going to get flipped up on its head. That means there's going to be some struggle that's happening, and it's already happening within her. Those babies are wrestling with one another. Here's how it continues, verse 24. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her room. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment, so they named him Hairy. I'm not making it up. His name means hairy. Esau means hairy. That's real creative, I know, right? So you've got this kid, he comes out really hairy, so we're going to name him Hairy. That's his name, Esau. Let's see what Jacob's name means. Verse 26, after this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so he was named heel grabber. Jacob, it means heel grabber. That's what it means. I know. I don't know how you came to naming your kids, but this is an option. See how they come out. Maybe one of your kids would be named like backwards or upside down because it comes out in the wrong way or something like that. All right? So, but here's the thing. The name heel grabber has more meaning to it than just that was what was happening coming out and being born, right? It has everything to do with how you would trip somebody up, right? You grab their heel, you trip somebody up. And that's what Jacob's life is going to be like. It's going to be that way with his brother. It's going to be that way with his father. It's going to be that way with his uncle Laban. As we come and to find out, as you continue to read his story, it's super important that we understand that piece of it, because that's his life. He's always trying to get something from someone else, something that he feels he deserves to have, that he wants to have. In fact, it becomes a pattern in his life. He wrestles with someone, and then he flees from that person, and then he'll meet God. And then the cycle repeats. He wrestles with someone, he runs away from that person, and then he meets with God. In fact, it's such an important pattern that in my nerdiness, I made a little diagram. This is what you see throughout his life. If you continue to read his story, you can see how he's going to wrestle with people, flee from them, and then he meets with God. So he's going to wrestle with his brother Esau. We already see that in the birth narrative, but he's going to wrestle with him and trick him out of the birthright, meaning that because Esau is the firstborn, that he gets the larger portion of inheritance when the parents pass away. And he tricks him out of that with a bowl of soup. I don't know why, but that's how it goes. And then Esau, he's going to take Esau's blessing. Isaac loves Esau and wants to bless him. And Jacob and his mother conspire together to trick Isaac into giving him the blessing, to giving Jacob the blessing. And they do it by like having Jacob wear some goat skin, so it's real furry. How hairy does somebody have to be that you could trick somebody with goat skin, right? Have you ever pet a goat? Like, it's pretty coarse and thick, right? I don't know. It's a crazy story. But he takes it from them, and then he finds out that Esau wants to kill him. And so he runs away. He flees, and he's going to go to his uncle, Laban. And on the way, he meets with God, and God says, I'm going to bless you right? I'm choosing you, and I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to protect you. And so Jacob gets to Laban's household, and now he's going to wrestle with Laban. But Laban is the one that's kind of doing the heel grabbing here, right? So on the night that Jacob was going to marry the younger daughter of Laban, Laban does a little switcheroo, puts the older daughter in there, right? And so he changes Jacob's wife. And then through the course of time, as he's worked there, Laban's going to change Jacob's wages 10 different times. Okay? And to where Jacob is finally like, I'm done with this, and he's going to take his family and they're going to flee, right? They're going to run away, which they do, and he meets God there, and we start seeing how God is fulfilling his promise to bless him and protect him. But then Jacob is going to meet his brother again. He's going to meet Esau, and that's where we have this last one, which is interesting because he's going to wrestle not with men, but with God. Even though the story is telling us there was this man that showed up that wrestled with Jacob. It's like it's a pun almost, right? They're kind of like showing like it's God, but we're talking about it as a man. Here's where I think there's a bit of a connecting piece for us, right? Where I think we connect with this is that we wrestle with people too. Not just because we disagree with them, right? Not just because they're at odds with us, but because maybe they have something that we want to have. Maybe we think we're more deserving of it than they are. Maybe we think we're smarter than them and we can get it from them. That maybe that promotion, right? Maybe that significant other. Whatever it might be, we are constantly wrestling with one another. And we see that in Jacob's life. Now, as the story continues to unfold, we see that Jacob is going to wrestle with this guy, who's going to wrestle with God. And this is the place where Jacob is going to have his name changed. And to set the story up well, as we look at Genesis chapter 32, you can flip there if you want to. Genesis 32, we have this time that Jacob has sent his family on the other side, and he's left alone. And he's going to wrestle with this man all night long. He won't let go, won't stop wrestling with this man until this man blesses him, till he gets what he wants. And interestingly, this man, God, does something different for him, gives him something else. So, well, if you're in chapter 25, we're just going to go to chapter 32, looking at verse 27, and this is the conversation now that God is having with Jacob as they're wrestling. The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but wrestles with God." Or God fights. That's what Israel means. "Because you have struggled with or wrestled with God and with humans and have overcome." The interesting thing about his name is that it has this double meaning. Like he can wrestle with God, or he can see that God fights for him. So he wrestles with God, or does God fight for you? That's the whole thing. And it's like this big wrestling match back and forth, because as you read Jacob's story, from this point on, sometimes he acts like Jacob. He's trying to do things to get it for himself. And sometimes he's trusting that God is going to do it for him. Sometimes he's Jacob. Sometimes he's Israel. And the name just has this way of looking like this wrestling match. Eventually, Jacob and his family, they arrive in Egypt, and they're being ruled by another nation, right? They become this nation of Israel, this group of people, but this other nation now starts to oppress them, starts to do some great injustice to them. And they can continue to fight with this nation, or try to, being slaves and having no army and no weapons and nothing of their own. Or they can trust God to fight for them. And that's what happens, is that God sends someone to deliver them, to rescue them, to call them out of Egypt so that they can be a new people. And eventually they get called out and they become formed as this new people at this great big mountain, and God continues to work on them so that they can be a kingdom of not warriors and not people that have this elite status to where they can conquer everyone, but a kingdom of priests. People that serve in God's temple courts, and people that are there to represent the people to God and God to the people, like this go-between. That's the type of people that they're supposed to be. And the funny thing is they kind of start doing that. They kind of do it sometimes. Sometimes they are Israel, this nation that's inviting other nations into God's kingdom and representing them on God's behalf and ushering God's blessing. And other times they're like Jacob, just thinking about themselves and what they can get out of it and actually wrestling with these other nations. This goes on for so long that the prophets start looking for this one person that's going to finish what Israel was supposed to do. This one person that they can put their hope in, that would provide a way to be the nation that they were called into being, to be the people that God had called them into being. One of those prophets, his name is Hosea. And in Hosea 11:1 is really interesting because as you see here, it's talking about this whole nation as if it's one person. Right? Those two children that were wrestling in there now spread out and became two nations, and now it's supposed to be one person that's going to lead them forward. And it's interesting how it's worded. Right? This is what God is doing. It says, when Jacob was a child, I loved him, and I called him out of Egypt. I called him my son. It's God identifying and drawing them out of here. This is exactly what the New Testament writers pick up on. This is how they are connecting Jesus with Jacob, with Israel. The thing that Israel left unfinished that Jesus is supposed to do. But how is Jesus supposed to do this? What does that look like? How do they connect him back to this? Well, we're going to skip ahead a little bit because I just went through the history of this part right here. We're going to go to Matthew. So Matthew chapter 2, we often read this during Christmas time, right? Because it's another birth story. It's Jesus' birth story. So instead of Jacob's birth story and then them leading to Egypt, and now there's this oppressive regime, this kingdom, and king that's trying to kill this nation. Now we see this as Jesus. He's an infant, and he's in another kingdom that's trying to kill him. But this is what we see happening here, how they connected. This is going to be Matthew chapter 2, verse 14. 2:14. So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod, that's the king. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet Hosea, out of Egypt I called my son. See, they're making this connection back to Jacob and the nation, this group of people, what they were supposed to be. They're seeing that Jesus is the one in which they're putting their hope, to be this one to lead them forward out of this wrestling match between human beings and between God. There's got to be a different way forward, but what does that look like? How does Jesus do this? Well, I'm glad you asked. It's actually another prophet that mentions this. It's also found in Matthew chapter 12. In Matthew chapter 12, this is God speaking through the prophet Isaiah about what this one who is called out of Egypt is supposed to do, right? How do they go about this? And pay special attention to how much wrestling or lack of wrestling is actually happening here. Instead of fighting against someone, there's something else going on here. So this is Matthew chapter 12, starting in verse 18. Here is my servant whom I have chosen. the one I love in whom I delight. If you're familiar with Jesus' story at all, you might be recalling Matthew chapter 2, where Jesus is baptized and God is present there, and he's speaking these words. I will put my spirit on him, and he will proclaim justice to the nations. He will not quarrel or cry out. No one will hear his voice in the streets. A bruised reed he will not break. A smoldering wick he will not snuff out, till he has brought justice through to victory. Now, at the surface of it, you're like, okay, what does that mean? What does that look like? But do you see the different image here? Instead of this heel grabbing and this wrestling with these other people or wrestling with God and trying to get my own things my own way, he's doing something quite opposite, isn't he? Instead of quarreling, right? Arguing with people, fighting with them, verbally lashing out at them, he's not going to do that at all. He's not going to cry out. He's not going to argue. It's the opposite of wrestling, right? What about these bruised reeds, right? They're so bruised because of life and lights, and because of life and wrestling with other people. We're just bruised human beings, and we can be so easily broken. But he's going to be so different, so opposite. He could so easily break us, and yet he's going to do something different to where, even though we're bruised, we won't be broken. We're people that we're at the end of our rope, right? Or that just that little hint of a flicker of a flame could be so easily extinguished. And yet he's not going to put it out. That's not wrestling, is it? It's not fighting anymore. It's completely different. No wonder why Isaiah finishes the way he does in verse 21. He says, in his name, the nations will put their hope. They're hoping that it's through this one that we can find a way forward, that we don't have to keep fighting with each other and wrestling with one another just to get what we think we want or what we think will make our life better if we just grab the heel of someone else, take it from them, trick them out of it, get it because I think I deserve it. There's a different way forward, and it brings us hope, and it's found in this new name, this new identity, and a new way of living that Jesus leads us through. So how does he do it, right? How does Jesus lead us through it? He not just, this is said about him, but he fulfills this. He fulfills this in his life. We're going to skip ahead a little bit more to get a little more clarity on what Jesus is going to do. We're going to actually go from Matthew to Luke. It's another gospel account. Luke chapter 22. And in Luke chapter 22, at this point, it's far into Jesus' ministry. He knows he has to be that suffering servant. He knows it's time to be betrayed by one of his own disciples. He is going to be arrested, and he's going to be beaten. He's going to be falsely accused. He's going to be murdered by being put up on this Roman death device, this cross. He knows that's going to happen, and so he is going to take his disciples into this garden, and he is now going to pray. Just like Jacob's parents prayed about their situation, now Jesus is going to go and pray. And here's how this goes. Verse 39 of chapter 22 of Luke. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. That's super important. These are people that are trying to be like him, right? They're following his example. They're trying to live the way he's teaching them to live. They're Jesus followers. They're disciples. They're going to operate in his name, okay? Super important. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down, and he prayed, and here is his prayer. "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." Does that sound like wrestling to you? This whole taking the cup, it's the idea that he has got to go through this time of suffering. And if there was another way that God could accomplish his plan, his will, if there's a different way, let's do that. But if there isn't, then God, I want your way more than I want my way. I want your will more than I want my will. This is Jesus' way forward. This is Jesus leading us to this path to stop wrestling with one another. You're not getting your way. So instead of lashing out, what is Jesus going to do? What is the Father's will? No more lashing out. No more arguing to get what you want and convince the other person that you're right. Instead, how about speaking kind words? Encouraging words into their life. It's no more wrestling, but now we have kindness. Because they're bruised reeds. Their whole life has been about wrestling. You are a bruised reed. Your life has been wrestling, and it's led to nothing but bumps and bruises, and you could so easily be broken. Jesus offers a way of gentleness, protecting you and bringing healing instead of breaking you. He knows that your life is just this little flicker. You got barely anything left. You're so worn out and so exhausted from this life that it would be so easy just to put it out. Instead, he comes with compassion to fan those flames, to get it going again and give you life. That's the way forward with Jesus. That's why the nations can put their hope in his name, because he is finishing what Jacob started. He's finishing what the Israelite nation failed to do, right? That they left unfinished, probably be a better way to say that. He's bringing life into this instead of wrestling. And it, of course, leads to his death. But this is us. And anyone that puts their hope in this name of Jesus, in other words, going in his way, right? Being a disciple of his, being a Jesus follower, do you know what happens? Your name gets changed. It does. No matter what name or label is put on you, your name gets changed. It gets changed to Jesus' name. What these new followers of Jesus are going to be called, they're called little Christs. That's what the title Christian means. It means little Christ. So there's these little Jesuses all around that are living in this way, that they're stopped wrestling with human beings, they stopped wrestling with God. It said, God, your way, not my way. I'm going to bring gentleness into this. I'm going to bring kindness into this. I'm going to bring compassion. That's how I'm going to respond. Because I look at people and I see how we're arguing and wrestling with one another. I see that we're just bruised reeds and, well, in a light that's just about ready to be put out. That's what we get to be. We get to be that in his name. No wonder why his name has hope for us, right? And it's only in his name because he's the one that finished it. He's the one that actually lived all the way through it. He finished what Jacob and his nation left unfinished. It's also what makes communion really important. Communion is reminding us that it's Jesus' name that we have our hope, not our own name, not in our nickname, not in changing our nickname, nothing like that. But by putting our hope in Jesus' name, our name gets changed and we get to be like him. No more wrestling. And this is a reminder for us of what he did. It cost him his life. Bruised, I would say his body was bruised. That flicker of life, was it taken out from him? Absolutely. He laid down his life for us. Your invitation here today is to be thinking about how you can put your hope in Jesus' name, living in his way instead of your way, being that kind word, being that gentleness, being that compassion in the world of wrestling. And you're welcome to come and be a part of communion. Use it as a reminder of where your hope really lies, and it's not in you. It's in Jesus and his name that he made for himself.